Russia has taken full control of Avdiivka, the battleground town in eastern Ukraine that has been the focus of its fury for months.
Kharkiv again, and this is a scene of yet. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. I'm speaking to you today from Kharkiv, and we're going to cover three topics: the fall of Avdiivka and what appears to be the assassination of two Putin opponents, Alexei Navalny in a penal colony in Russia, and Maxim Kuzminov, a pilot who defected to Ukraine earlier in the war. We'll start with Avdiivka. Now, this is a small industrial town in eastern Donbass, just effectively an industrial satellite of Donetsk, which has been under Russian control. Donetsk has been under Russian control and since 2014. But it's been the focus of Russia's military advances for months, and Ukrainian forces have been holding out there against relentless rocket, artillery, and tank assaults. In many ways, this town resembled Bakhmut, the city that Ukraine fought so hard to defend, but ultimately ceded to Russia in May. On Saturday, almost a week ago, the new commander of Ukraine's armed forces announced that his forces were retreating. The commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade, who was one of the units in the town, said his men were outnumbered by about 15-1. Over the next few days, over the last weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, Ukrainian forces retreated. There are varying accounts of exactly how that went down. The Institute for the Study of War said it appeared to be orderly, but new reports have now emerged that dozens, scores, possibly even hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have been taken prisoner by the Russians. This is undeniably bad news and sad news for Ukraine. Avdiivka's value was perhaps primarily symbolic, but it does also sit on a major railway junction. There are fears that now that Avdiivka has fallen, it may trigger perhaps an uptick in Russia's advances. But more broadly speaking, it's important to note that there haven't been significant changes of territory across the front line for many months, and the analysis of Western military experts is that is unlikely to change. President Zelensky refused to comment on the cost at which Ukraine had held out there, but he did say that Russian losses were 7 times higher than Ukrainians. Now, we know the Ukrainians had claimed in November last year that 7,000 Russians had been killed in a single month-long assault that also lost them 100 tanks and 250 armored vehicles. That was last year. That was in November. Of course, the fight there has been continuing fairly relentlessly for another 2.5 months since then. There's no doubt that both sides have paid a high cost for Avdiivka, but as ever with these attacks, with these assaults, it's the attacking side that pays the higher cost. In news from Russia, Alexei Navalny, the prominent anti-corruption campaigner who was President Vladimir Putin's political nemesis, has died in prison in the Polar Wolf penal colony in northern Arctic Russia. Now, this has caused outrage and anger both inside and outside Russia, with world leaders paying tribute to Navalny for his courageous and principled work to stand up to Vladimir Putin. Navalny had already survived a poisoning attempt on his life. He was poisoned with the Novichok military-grade nerve agent, which had allegedly been sprayed onto his underwear just shortly before he boarded a flight in eastern Russia 4 years ago. He managed to get to Germany and his life was saved by medics in Berlin. But he made the decision to go back to Russia and was arrested the day he landed and has been in prison ever since. He was serving a 19-year prison sentence, which had been added to. And indeed, he was standing trial on more trumped-up charges at the time of his death. Now, President Zelensky here in Ukraine blamed Russia, said Russia killed him. Latvia's president was similarly outspoken, said that President Putin had blood on his hands. Clearly, the Russian state is culpable for Navalny's death because of the horrific conditions that he was being held in. We understand he'd spent much of his time in that penal colony in a punishment cell. His body, as I understand, has not yet been released. There's been speculation about the way he might have been killed, whether there were bruises on his body, whether he'd been deliberately murdered. It certainly seems likely that he has been murdered, but of course that is not confirmed yet. In similarly sinister news, we believe the Russian pilot Maxim Kuzminov, who defected to Ukraine by flying his M8 helicopter to Kharkiv, where I am now, has been assassinated in southern Spain, not far from the holiday resort town of Benidorm. Kuzminov was 28 when he flew his Mi-8 from Russian territory into Ukraine, having been in contact with Ukraine's military intelligence services. At the time, it was seen as a major propaganda coup for Ukraine, evidence that high-trained, valuable soldiers within the Russian armed forces were unhappy with the way the war was being conducted, unhappy fighting against Ukraine. 2 co-pilots and crew on board that helicopter died during that defection, and there are competing claims. Russia accused him of killing them before he took off. Ukraine claimed they were, in their words, neutralized when they landed because they resisted arrest. There were reports in Moscow that the intelligence services had orders to eliminate him at any cost, however long it took. His body was discovered in a garage riddled with bullets, and reports emerging today that those bullets have now been confirmed to have been of Russian origin. That would appear to be a calling card that Moscow wants the world to know that they were behind his death. Now, the reason Spanish authorities were initially slow to identify Kuzmakov was because we understand he was living in Spain, as perhaps you'd expect, under a false identity. And the first reports suggested that the Ukrainian national who had been killed was 33 years old, but officials here in Ukraine have also confirmed his death. So there we have it. It's been a fairly bleak week for Ukraine. The retreat from Avdiivka, a prominent Putin critic apparently murdered inside Russia, and a very prominent Russian defector murdered in Spain, showing both the reach and the power of Russia's military and its intelligence services. I should add, it comes at a time when Western officials have been warning that Vladimir Putin shows no sign of having given up on his ambition to conquer all of Ukraine. But they say he has no real plan to do that other than simply slogging it out for as long as it takes. And that is perhaps what we've seen on the battlefield. The assessment of those Western officials was that Putin is relying on the sheer weight of Russian numbers and military kit to tell, effectively relying on Russia's mass, its size, and its resources to overwhelm Ukraine. Ukraine is still fighting back, and we've seen some fairly unpleasant drone footage, I should say, this week of what appears to be a Himars strike against Russian soldiers in southern Kherson. Suggestions that they were lining up for a parade when they were hit by the guided HIMARS rockets, which of course are fired from a multiple launch rocket system with a range of about 50 miles, very accurate. They can hit a target the size of a car at that range. One of the most significant weapons deliveries, capability improvements that Ukraine's Western allies have provided over the last 2 years. And of course, so I'm speaking to you, it's on the eve of the second anniversary of this war. So it's time that people are taking stock of where both sides have got to. As ever, if you do have questions and you're watching on YouTube, please write them in the comments below and we will do our best to answer them next time. Questions from last week. Did the Zircon hypersonic missile hit anything? Well, it did. It landed, it hit the ground in a district of Kyiv, created a crater and severed some high voltage power lines, plunging that district into darkness. Now, it sparked some sort of humor in Ukraine because it didn't sort of appear to hit any high value targets. The wires themselves were fairly easily repaired. There's often the response you get in Ukraine when these after these missile strikes, is a sort of sense of resignation, disbelief, but questioning what was Russia aiming for, because it's not always clear to ordinary people. So simple answer is that Zircon hypersonic missile, one of the most sophisticated missiles in the Russian arsenal, hit a patch of ground and severed some electricity cables. How much is a Trump presidency feared here? That's a good question, particularly because we've heard the warnings from Donald Trump that he would encourage Moscow to attack NATO allies who are not paying their 2% of GDP towards collective defense. It's a hard question to answer on behalf of a country. I mean, clearly there are very mixed opinions here, but I would say the overwhelming sense is one of concern. Ukraine has its hands full dealing with the problems that it's facing today without worrying particularly too much about the problems it might be facing this time next year if there's a change of American president. And the final question is, how serious are the Russian assaults across the Eastern Front? And again, that slightly brings us back to where we started with Avdiivka. The first point I'd make is look at the weather. You can see, I mean, I'm standing here, it's freezing cold, there's snow on the ground, and that is true across a lot of the Eastern Front at the moment. Conditions are really hard for the soldiers. The front lines are, whilst not frozen, they are pretty frosty in terms of the movement. There isn't much. Avdiivka has been the exception. What could change is that if Russia is able to cement its positions in Avdiivka, that might allow it to take resources away from there and focus their attacks somewhere else. Now, that could be in Kupiansk near here, where we've seen Kupiansk in Kharkiv, in eastern Kharkiv, has been a focus of Russian assaults for many, many months, but not quite as intense as Avdiivka. So that's a slightly rambling response. What I'm trying to say is, there are lots of attacks across a very long front line. Conditions are hard. There isn't an awful lot. There hasn't been an awful lot of movement, but it's always worth watching where Russian resources are focused, and the change in Avdiivka could allow them to shift their focus to start a new offensive somewhere else. There were suggestions just before it fell that they'd brought 15,000 troops into that small town on the edge of Donetsk. We may see those 15,000, or at least some of them, redeployed. Thank you for watching. I'll say it again. If you do have questions, please leave them in the comments below on YouTube. Or if you're watching, if you're listening rather, on a podcast, then please don't forget to subscribe to The Frontline with me, Jerome Starkey. And if you're watching on YouTube, then do subscribe to The Sun for all of our videos.